As I say, I started off as a bird watcher and butterfly collector. I mean, I've always, nature has always been very important to me. I think it's quite a good thing to start with a bit of history. My parents, before the war, had farmed in Warwickshire. We had a farm which was requisitioned during the war to turn it into a huge ammunition dump. And so they wanted to start farming again after the war. My father had been in the army. They were looking around for somewhere and they found the farm here in this house. And my father farmed it pretty conventionally. I mean, it was the current vogue, so it meant using a lot of sprays and fertilizers. When I got married in 1964, he made the farm over to me, which we were able to do in those days. And I went on farming in the same way. And during that time, the RSPB was undergoing quite a transformation because the Wildlife and Countryside Act had been passed in '82, I think. And everybody breathed a sigh of relief and thought that nature was going to get protected now. We'd got proper SSSIs and they were being looked after. Everybody was quite optimistic in the RSPB. And then as my time there developed, it became clear that actually things weren't going at all well and farmland birds were under a lot of trouble. And then I started thinking, well, if I'm going to be promoting farming for birds, I better have a look at what I'm actually doing on my own farm. I didn't realise how bad things were. Well, nobody realised how bad things were. Once artificial fertilisers and artificial insecticides and herbicides had been developed in the 30s, and we had been forced to intensify during the war. It's the sort of agriculture that followed. Because the arable fields had far fewer weeds in them, because the grasslands had far fewer other species, insect numbers collapsed entirely. Because insect numbers collapsed, bird numbers collapsed. It was clear that there was a terrible downward spiral. And we're now looking for ways in which we can produce food economically to satisfy the world's need for food, and at the same time do it in such a way that at least nature is protected from getting any worse and that we hope restored.
We've been experimenting with regenerative agriculture here at Kemerton since the 1980s. We've always tried to develop new models which can be copied and used by other farmers. In an ever-shifting world of farm subsidies and food prices and farming policy, we've tried to find ways of continuing to farm profitably whilst also maximising the spaces around the farm where biodiversity can flourish. So, for example, we've planted a lot of woodland in small blocks in corners of the farm. We've experimented with arable field margins, which are unsprayed. We did the first of these in the country back in the 80s, and we've created wetland areas.
I'd always wanted a wetland and a lake, and I'd always assumed that because we didn't have any streams of any size and you had to dam something to get it, I couldn't have that. And then I remembered seaside holidays and digging with my bucket in the sand and the holes that I dug filling up with water, that I could do that on a large scale. We dug out all the sand and gravel, we made a saucer, and that then filled with water. There were strict planning controls. We were told to restore that, and in fact we didn't really have to do hardly any of the things that they said because nature did them for us. That suddenly then meant that our interest, having been, as I say, largely botanical, suddenly became bird interest again. And I can't remember how many species we've now recorded on the lake, but 160 or 70 or something.
I wouldn't say that we were unaware of the environment, but it was starting to become an issue. I think people were realising that the impacts that modern agriculture had on the environment. And whilst I was still keen on producing as much as we could, Adrian with his RSPB hat and his great interest in botany, was starting to sort of made it quite clear that when I came here that he wanted me to take that on board and incorporate it into the farm.
I would always encourage other people looking to get into regenerative agriculture to look at their potential strengths and weaknesses. It's been natural for us to focus on wood pasture at Kemerton because we have an internationally important assemblage of deadwood invertebrates, beetles and so forth, that live in deadwood, very often in open-grown parkland trees. I think that this model, which is as profitable as our previous model, as profitable as most cattle farmers' model, can be rolled out across the country, and it can deliver huge carbon capture gains across lots of grassland where it isn't currently being maximised, and huge biodiversity gains. Of course, I've talked about carbon capture. That's one of its key benefits, is that it is capturing atmospheric carbon, sequestering it through root action into the soil, building up soil, which is essentially carbon, capturing that carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere, and it can contribute massively to our carbon reduction targets. I met Rob through my volunteer work with the National Trust. I was on a number of their advisory boards, and Rob was presenting to the leadership team of the Trust, and I was blown away by his outcomes, both in biodiversity but also in terms of gross margin. I mean, his profitability was better than ours because he was outwintering stock and he didn't have any winter feed costs. It looked like a model that I could bring back to my team here at Kemerton. I had to persuade my father and my then farm manager that this is something that we could profitably do.
Just from the last 4 years that we've been working here, we've already seen the pastures improving in terms of their diversity of wildflower species and grasses, but also in terms of their ecosystem function. So we see infiltration rates for the water improving, and that helps us because we grow more grass when it's really dry in the summer, but also the fields stay dry in the winter because the water infiltrates away. We're seeing increases in wildlife, and we've got dung beetles coming back to the farm, we've got wildflowers right throughout the pastures, and the bird life here is incredible. And what we hope to build for the future is a resilient farming business based on these diverse pastures, one that could maybe withstand future changes in the marketplace, future policy changes with grants and subsidies changing all the time within the agriculture sector, so that we can have a sustainable business, and with or without grants in the future we'll be able to make money whilst also looking after the environment. If we can demonstrate the value of the wildlife, not just in its own sake but also to the business itself, then I think that shows to other farms in the area and potentially within this country that we can produce food sustainably that's good for the environment but also good for our back pocket. So as part of our work here, we are working on a project to record and monitor all the work we do. So every grazing cell that we graze, we monitor it before and after, and we see what the regrowth is. We're also looking at the soils and the impact of our grazing over time on ecosystem function, but also on the wildlife. And that allows us to assess the performance of our grazing to see how it's helping the wildlife, how it's helping the cattle, and how it's helping our business. One of the key objectives when I came here was to try and make the cattle pay their way as much as anything else. And so part of that was ensuring that they could perform within a very low input system where they had to survive on what the environment could provide. And initially that gave us some huge challenges in terms of the fertility rate and the conception rate that we were getting. Over time we've selected for the animals that work in the system, and we're getting there, and the results this year have been much better. We've had over 95% conception rate on the cows, but it's taken time, it's been difficult, but it needed that work to make sure we've got cattle that work in the system for the future.
Hi, I'm Mitch, I'm a stockman here. My role is basically looking after the cows on a day-to-day basis. We're with the bulls now, which are our sort of main genetics pool, I suppose. And these bulls are all quite closely related. So what we try and do is pick the best genetics and then use them over and over again so that all the cows are quite similar. So we use just simple plastic electric fence posts and pulley wire to keep the bulls in. It's really portable, so it allows us to split big fields up into smaller paddocks and just means we can manage the grass and the grazing really well.
So what's really important for us with the cattle on the farm is that they thrive within the system, that the environment that we provide and that nature provides, it's a walk in the park for them to produce a calf every year on time without any problems. If we don't have that, then the females that can't manage that will end up in the food chain from this regenerative farm, producing a really great product for people to eat. And those that do will stay here, and we've had cows live to 14, even 16 years of age, which is really old for a productive cow. And they're providing calves year after year, living in this natural environment. And I think you couldn't want a better place to be, really. There's nowhere I'd rather be in May during calving than when we're doing calving checks, 10 o'clock at night. The cows have to do it all on their own. We don't want to intervene. We need to check to make sure they're okay. Sit up here with a bottle of cider as the sun goes down is the perfect place. We're trying to create animals that are working in harmony with nature and help make sustainable, financially free family farms of the future.
Given the unavoidable effects of weather, we have got now a stable, well-balanced system that should see us looking well into the future.